Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are thrilled to have author and journalist Dan Slater here with us today to discuss his new book, The Incorruptibles, which takes a deep dive into the Jewish criminal underworld of New York City in the 1910s. A world of gambling dens, prostitution, pickpockets, loan sharks, of king pimps and queen offenses, coke fiends, junkies, horse poisoners, the Yiddish Black Hand. A world of sex, drugs, and ragtime music. And the brave men and women who stood up to the vice and corruption, a group that became known as the Incorruptibles. Welcome, sir, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Matt. It's awesome to be here, and I love your introduction. I might have to steal that for future podcasts and appearances. The horse poisoners, right? I mean, you cannot make that up.
We're going to get to that, yeah.
Yes, and let me extend the welcome as well, Dan. We're so thrilled to have you. Matt and I have been discussing you and this amazing book over the last few weeks, preparing for our chat today. So I'm just thrilled to have you.
Thank you for that wonderful welcome, and it's fantastic to be here with you speaking today about the Incorruptibles.
Great. Well, so we want to dive right in. And this book is really the story of two men, Abe Schoenfeld and Arnold Rothstein, who came from similar backgrounds, but whose lives took completely opposite turns. Why don't we begin with you telling our listeners about each of these key players in your story?
Yeah, so Arnold Rothstein was born to prosperous uptowners in New York City in the 1880s. He was from Russian Jewish ancestry, but his family had arrived a little bit earlier than the majority of the Russian Jews had. His family dated back to the 1840s, and they had made pretty good in New York in the garment industry. His dad was very pious. He owned a cotton goods manufacturer. But Arnold was raised more, he liked, the streets. He liked the gambling. In the 1880s and 1890s in Manhattan, you could get a gambling game pretty much anywhere. There were technically laws, but nothing was enforced. And he loved that scene. And I think because his father was such an outsized figure in, the upper world, not just as a big guy in the garment industry, but also as a philanthropist, I think Arnold felt he had a lot to live up to. But instead of, trying to go to Harvard or become a lawyer or start a company, he said, I'm going to be the best gambler in the city. And that's what he set out to do with his life. Meanwhile, downtown on the Lower East Side, where the ghetto was, Abe Schoenfeld was also the son of a prominent figure, but his father was a reformer. And he was the father was involved in all sorts of different kinds of reform, trying to reform the garment industry and represent the workers, and then trying to reform the crime problem on the Lower East Side with all the Jewish prostitution that began to become a sort of known problem around 1900. So Abe follows his father into that world of being a reformer. And by the time Abe starts to come of age as a teenager, between about 1905 and 1910, underworld reform is kind of where people are starting to head who are from his world and don't go into the underworld. And it sort of wasn't, it wasn't just, a coincidence that this was what was happening at the time, because all these anti-vice laws were starting to come into being. So all of a sudden, there were state laws against alcohol, drugs, prostitution. And so the reformers were now had these laws behind them. And they also had some money behind them because wealthy folks at the time were funding a lot of the crime wars, trying to eliminate things that they saw as embarrassing for the city.
It's
So
such a
Abe and Arnold, obviously, they wind up on very different sides of the criminal line, and those are two of the three or four figures that the book follows.
it's really such a fascinating time period. You got the beginnings of the modern age with movies, automobiles, electricity, Times Square's just beginning, the beginning of the Bureau of Investigation, which would become the FBI, and we've seen the first federal drug laws come into being. Is there anything in particular that drew you to want to write about that time period?
To me, that time period has always been just magnetic for many of the reasons that you say. I mean, it was the beginning of so much. And what first got me into it was a book called Low Life by Luc Sante that came out when I was probably 12 or 13. And it's a nonfiction book about generally about the underworld. It isn't a narrative, it's not a character and plot driven book, but it is a deep dive into what it was like to be a cop then, and sort of what it was like to live in the Lower East Side then. That was my first time. That was the first time I learned about that world. And ever since then, I had been fascinated by it. And also, that book, I think, was the first time I understood that my own roots were located in that time and place. So it was the personal connection, plus just the fascination with ragtime music, with the beginning of movies, and the beginning of American fashion. And all those things, those three things I just mentioned, were all being founded in the Lower East Side, which was, on the one hand, the largest ghetto in the world, or the most, at least the most densely packed urban area in the world, and also a place of amazing cultural ferment. So it was always on my mind. And then when I became a writer, you have your bucket list of subjects that you want to write about. So you finish a project and you go to the bucket list. And often on the bucket list, I'll have sort of, a location or a general subject, but then you're looking for that story. You're looking for the characters. You're looking for the narrative. And it was about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago that I finally stumbled on the narrative while I was working on another project that ended up publishing as a magazine story.
That was the rabbis,
Yeah,
the rabbis.
yeah, exactly. That was called Undercover in the Orthodox Underworld, and that was a project that I had originally thought might become a book, but it became a magazine piece, and that was a contemporary story about Orthodox rabbis in the tri-state area who had a little gang. They had a sideline beating up husbands in their community who refused to give their wives a religious divorce per the biblical, requirement. And so when a husband would refuse to give the get being the document that the wife needs to get out of the marriage, when they felt that a husband had unjustly refused the get, they would pull him into the back of a van, perhaps put a cattle prod on his testicles, whatever, break a couple of ribs until he decided to do the right thing. So I spent a long time reporting that story, again, thinking that it could be a candidate for a book-length narrative. It did become a magazine piece, but I did a ton of reporting and a ton of reading and research. And one of the subjects I was researching was the history of Jewish violence. We often hear about violence against, Jewish people, the Holocaust, the pogroms in Russia, but within the community itself, that was a subject that I was less familiar with. So as I started to read up on that, I would return periodically in my reading to the Lower East Side of New York City prior to World War One, and that's when I stumbled upon, the story that became this book we're here talking about now.
So I haven't had a chance to read the whole magazine piece yet, but I just am. It's such a wild story and so interesting.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm surprised that that group kind of ever went out of business. I feel like there could still be a need for them at times in today's society. The
There absolutely
shakedown of the.
is. When Mendel Epstein and his associates went off to prison in 2015, a new person appeared immediately.
Wow.
Younger guy became the new fraud father, as they
Wow.
called them
That's wild.
in the headlines. Yeah. Um,
Crazy.
but that was it. I mean, one of the things that got me about that story is it's really about control of women at the end of the day. There's a law within the religion that requires women to have their husband release them from the bonds of matrimony. Um, and without that law, you don't have the criminal sideline. And so these
Right.
rabbis began, in sort of a helpful way on the side of the women, but over time things get corrupted, and they started charging quite a bit of money.
Mm.
Um, and so, but yeah, that was an interesting story to work on, and it led me to this one.
So I want to talk. You brought up the control of women, and one thing I found interesting in the Incorruptibles was the independence of women we see at play. There's Isabella Goodwin, New York City's first female detective, who becomes a part of the Incorruptibles. But then on the other side of things, we have Antonia Rolnick, or Tony the Tough, which is a great nickname. And so she went through her life as a prostitute, embraces it, and eventually becomes a madam. And then at the end of the book, Abe goes on to say that to stop prostitution, women need to have more equal rights, and then they'd be able to get better jobs with equal pay and have alternatives to working the streets. So, what were your thoughts, kind of learning all these different pathways for the women in this story, and anything that you want to expand on that you wrote about in the book from on this subject?
Gosh, women were so central to this story, and obviously Tony the Tough. I felt she was probably my favorite character in the book. When I say character, she was a real person because this is a nonfiction book. But yeah, I feel like she was very typical, even though her life was extreme in many ways. She was a refugee. She arrives in New York, and she drops out of school when she's about 14. She joins the garment industry. That was very typical. The garment industry was comprised mostly of teenage, Jewish refugee women. Teenage, whatever you want to call a 15, 16, 17-year-old, but that was the majority of the industry. And there was a lot of poverty. There were no rights. And meanwhile, you had this huge prostitution scene on the Lower East Side, and a lot of the girls at the time who lived in the Lower East Side of the ghetto there, they they were sort of caught between that. Like prostitution was that pit that you kind of didn't want to fall into. And the sort of alternative, the people that didn't go Tony the Tough's route, one of the things they did do was they became advocates for all kinds of things. They led the strikes, and they sort of galvanized, the suffragettes uptown. So when I talk about underworld reform, that was tied in very much with the reform movements that are more familiar to us in history too.
Yeah, I don't think I understood how much Jewish organized crime led to the rise of the mafia, like the Italian mafia. I mean, Arnold gave Meyer Lansky his start, and he, like, interesting, literally taught Lucky Luciano how to dress and how to have proper table etiquette. Um, and so I guess it's fair to say that the early Jewish underworld paved the way for what we know as organized crime today.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it depends how far back you want to go, because you can go back 1,000 years to the establishment of the money lending law, which was the law we talked about, the get law for the Orthodox Jews. Christianity was really galvanized around the 11th century by the law against money lending. A bunch of monks got together and decided, hey, we need a law that everyone who's going to be, a Christian will abide by, and if you abide by the law, then you're a Christian. But we need some kind of law. And one of the first laws they came up with was the money lending law. And it was an odd time to come up with an anti-money lending law, because at the same time, capitalism was becoming sort of the world religion. So at a time when everyone needed credit, the Christians were saying you can't lend somebody money. So somebody needed to come in and fill in that gap. And the Jews famously were the people who filled that function. And I feel like if you want to really trace back to the beginning of organized crime, you can go all the way to that. And, it's not surprising wherever you go, it's going to be the sort of the marginalized, the oppressed, who are willing to take on the most risk to make a dollar. It's that way today in America, and it's been that way, all the time. So, the Jews lived in ghettos going back to at least the 14th century. And they were always on sort of the perimeter of whatever, the community was that allowed them to live there. And so they were always picking up the scraps. They were lending money. When the Tsar in Russia decided to make alcohol not illegal, but to put, restrictions on it, the Jews came in and they, handled that. So when these folks arrive in New York in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there's an extensive background in this, not just being a pickpocket or stealing a horse, but it was organizing an underworld market, forming a club so that people who do this thing can band together and advocate for political advantage, decide which, candidate they're going to support. One of the most amazing things I discovered when writing The Incorruptibles was that there was this union of pimps. There was this fraternity of pimps that got together at a cafe on Second Avenue, and they were actually incorporated under New York state law. And I have the incorporation papers and the bylaws that lays out things like unemployment, pay, funeral rights, because pimps weren't allowed to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. And each underworld niche had a kind of a union like that, which is kind of amazing to think about. And this is 2 decades before, the Jazz Age comes along with, Luciano and Lansky.
They called that the Independent Benevolent Association.
Yeah.
Why? Where did they get that name from? Like, why would you name a group of pimps Benevolent Association? I don't.
Because if you call people, you can call yourself whatever you want and people will believe it, right? So why not? In their eyes, they were providing a much needed service to the New York City community, but it is quite an ironic name.
So can we please, please, please talk about how Meyer Wolfsheim from The Great Gatsby was based on Arnold Rothstein? Matt and I were talking at length about that. We were just so intrigued. And that Fitzgerald credited him for inspiring the book.
I think at some point before I started working on this book, I knew that Meyer Wolfsheim had been based on Arnold Rothstein. I can't remember where I saw that or where I learned that, but I feel like it has crept into American pop culture, that factoid, to some extent. But I didn't know how or why. I was fascinated by this idea that, oh my gosh, at some point, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's one of the most beloved authors of the 20th century, at some point he was moving in the same world as Arnold Rothstein, and they met somehow. And that meeting was impactful enough for this author to inspire not just a character in the book, but to inspire the book, the great American novel. And I tried to trace where it is that they might have met. And there's a handful of places that they may have mixed. I don't know how many times they met. I don't know if they met regularly. But they would go to parties out on Long Island. They had a mutual acquaintance or a friend, Herbert Bayard Swope, who was Arnold Rothstein's old buddy from when they were young men. And Arnold was a sort of a bookmaker on the rise, and Herbert was a young reporter at the World newspaper. And they were both gambling addicts. So that's how they connected. And Arnold would lend Herbert money, and Herbert in return would help manage news coverage in ways that were favorable to Rothstein. And then they both became huge figures in their own right. Arnold Rothstein became Arnold Rothstein, and Swope went off to report on World War I, and he won the first Pulitzer Prize for reporting, and came back and assumed he became the managing editor of the World, and he became very wealthy. It's not clear how this newspaper editor, became so wealthy that he bought one of the biggest penthouses in Manhattan and had this gigantic mansion out on the North Shore of Long Island. There's a lot of speculation about how that happened, and maybe some insider trading with a newspaper editor getting financial news ahead of time. But anyway, it was Swope who was throwing these big parties out on Long Island, and those parties, of course, were the inspiration for Gatsby and that whole world. And so there's probably a good chance that Fitzgerald and Rothstein met at those parties. And when Fitzgerald was a student at Princeton around 1914, 15, 16, he and his pals at Princeton would go into the city, as college kids who go to Princeton have always done. And they would go to a lot of the sort of, the pre-war, they called them, the lobster palaces, which were these really opulent restaurants around Times Square. And so, they met again. I don't know how many times, but they circulated in the same world. And Fitzgerald enshrined Arnold Rothstein in a kind of an unforgettable figure who, on the one hand, has nothing to do with Arnold Rothstein. The characterization of Wolfsheim, at least physically, the way he speaks, probably is nothing like Rothstein at all. But I think that when you read that passage closely in the book, Fitzgerald has captured the essence of who Rothstein is in a way that he would have had to know him decently well to write it the way he did.
Didn't have molars for his what do you call
cufflinks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, of course, he didn't have molars for the cufflinks, but I don't think Arnold would have joked that he had molar. It wasn't some, bragging about violence or the violent side of his life was not something that he would have done. So there were many things like he didn't have hairy nostrils. He didn't speak in sort of, the stereotypical Yiddish way that Wolfsheim speaks in the book. A lot of those are kind of racialized characteristics. But and I know that we haven't gotten to this part yet, but in the book, there's a moment where Wolfsheim is remembering back to the Rosenthal murder, the murder of Herman Rosenthal in 1912. Rosenthal and Rothstein had, of course, been good friends. Mm-hmm. And Fitzgerald fictionalizes that in the book. And there's this moment when Wolfsheim is remembering that murder of his old friend, and he was actually involved. Rothstein was somewhat involved in the murder, and that he allowed it to go forward. But in the book, we sort of see Wolfsheim exonerating himself, which I think that would have been very much something that was true to Arnold. I'm sure he exonerated himself. He told himself lots of stories in order to rationalize the life he led.
Well, here's a wild one that's always interested me. In the book, you talk about the infamous 1919 World Series, the White Sox versus the Cincinnati Reds. And it's believed that Arnold Rothstein was said to have been in on the fix or done the fix himself. You want to tell us a little bit about that? That's some craziness.
That is craziness. And again, the first time I learned about that, I don't know what year y'all were born. I'm probably much older. I was born in 1977. And when I was about 10, a movie came out called Eight Men Out.
I love that movie. Yeah.
That movie, right? And it is a
Say it ain't
scripted.
so, Joe.
It really, it's like classic period drama made in the 1980s, set in the 1910s. And there's like one scene in that movie where you see them cut to the figure that's supposed to be Rothstein. Maybe a couple scenes where you see this guy in a hotel with his silk bathrobe on, like pulling the strings. That was the first time I learned about sort of the general ins and outs of the story of the fix. But once I get into this book and I started seeing what the timeline of the narrative I was going to be telling was, and that I was indeed going to be pushing into the 20s, I said, okay, I'm going to have to deal with this fix in some way. So I read the book that Eight Men Out was based on, which was an incredible book published in the 60s by probably the best baseball historian of the 20th century. And he has a lot of information in that book about Rothstein's role in the fix, some of which is speculation, but much of which is documented. And just not to get too into it, the question is, did he fix the World Series? What seems likely to have happened is that he was approached by lesser people in the underworld, lesser bookmakers or gamblers who had a relationship with a baseball player, but they didn't have the money to fund the fix. The players said, we need $10,000 a piece. They didn't have that money. That at the time, $80,000 was roughly probably a couple $1 million today. So as what often happened, they went to their sort of angel investor, the VC guy, who was Arnold, and said, hey, if you can supply this money, we can facilitate all this. And I think that seems to have been how he got pulled into it. Incidentally, you guys probably have the galley copies of the book, which don't have the 60 plus photos, which appear in the final version, which comes out in a couple weeks. But among those 66 photos in the book, there's a beautiful spread, which gets a whole page in the book that is it's a shot of the Times building in Times Square on October 1st, 1919, during the first game of the World Series. Now, this was right before the advent of mass media and radio. So if you wanted to listen to, say, a baseball game, you would go to the outside of a newspaper office, and there'd be like the scoreboard literally on the outside of the building, and there'd be someone up there changing the numbers on the board, and sort of, it was more than a scoreboard because there was like a diamond, and they'd move the people around the diamond according to who was on which base. And I have this beautiful photo in there of the scoreboard, and you can see, I mean, all the fans are just packing Times Square, and it's raining outside on October 1st, and you can see shoeless Joe Jackson is batting cleanup for the Sox. And it's raining, and all these fans have their umbrellas out, and nobody knew that all these guys on the White Sox had agreed to throw the game because they were all being underpaid. That was sort of created this the environment for the fix. A lot of players were underpaid at the time, and also gambling and corruption stretched back to the very beginning of baseball, back in the 1860s. And that's another subject that I sort of fleck at in the book.
And you mentioned radio there. You said that because of radio and other forms of fast communication, a lot of cons were ruined. Like the famous fake horse track betting, where they would bring in the delay it, and so they knew who the winners were. And it's really interesting how technology both helped and hindered the criminal underworld at that time. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of technology in the book. Yeah, to me, that was one of the fascinating things I found out about how radio interfered with the big con, as it was known. Again, a movie from our childhood. It sort of predates me by a few years, but The Sting with Paul Newman and Robert Redford. I believe
Yeah.
it came out in what 1973. Famous movie. Watched it repeatedly when I was a kid, and it's of course how these two kind of low life pickpocket gambler types run, a sting on this guy that they want to get revenge on because he killed their friend, and they set up this fake or off track betting parlor, and that was called, I believe that was called the Rag, and it was something that happened in big cities around the country between about 1912 and again, ending with the advent of radio. Because after radio came along, there was no longer a delay between the end of an event and the reporting of the event. Before radio, when there was a delay, you could go to the people that you were trying to con and say, hey, we have a person working for us in the Western Union office that is willing to give us the results of a race before it goes out on the wire. And we can use that gap to give you the information about who won, and you can bet on et cetera. After radio came along, you could no longer do that. So the big con, the golden era of the big con, was the 1910s, which makes the movie The Sting not quite historically accurate because they decided to set that movie during the Great Depression, I believe, or I think the early 30s. The big con by then was no longer in use. It would have been dead for about 15 years. For fans of The Sting out there.
I'm a fan. I love it. Yeah, it's a great film.
And then also, we talk about technology. We haven't talked about the Incorruptibles and Abe Schoenfeld, which is really the heart of the book, but the secret vice crusade that is funded by these wealthy uptown German Jews who look down at the ghetto and say, all the crime among our Eastern European co-religionists is embarrassing. It's leading to more anti-Semitism. It'll be used eventually to pass, immigration restriction, et cetera, et cetera. They fund this secret war on crime and take this 21-year-old and sort of put him at the head of it all. And then the mayor installs Abe in the police department. That vice squad uses a lot of technology to do what it does. This was the very beginning of the wiretap.
Yeah.
Yeah, the wiretap, I think, comes along around 1911 or 12.
I was surprised to read that in there. I'm like, they're tapping phones in like 1911. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And there were the same debates happening then as we hear now about privacy, and about whether or not that should be allowed to happen and under what circumstances, and how the Fourth Amendment was going to be interpreted in order to allow for that.
But you had switchboard operators who could hear everything, which was a part of the book as well.
Yes, yes, there were these switchboard operators who were everywhere, hotels, anywhere there were a lot of phones. And so, yeah, if you were nice to those people, you drop them a present on Christmas and whatnot, then you could get a lot of information. So Abe was a crafty guy, and he really specialized in getting information. He had a lot of informants who worked for him, starting from when he was a teenager and a very young reformer. And by the time he's 21 and he's given this incredible responsibility of all this money and all these cops behind him, he had a lot of people on his payroll, including many telephone operators.
So we're talking about radio and other technology, and another thing that we were wondering about is it's really interesting how life influences art, and then we have gangster movies glorifying the money and women, and then art influencing life, and these gangsters are seeing the movies and trying to emulate them. How much do you think movies played a part in the lives of these early gangsters?
That is such a great question, because the gangster genre in film starts to come along in the 20s, but of course it predates that by a bit. I think one of the first gangster movies was a 15 of a famous 15-minute short called The Musketeers of Pig Alley that came out in 1912. And some of the first ever movies were crime movies. The Great Train Robbery, or whatever that film was called in 1903, that had that incredible action scene, which was very new at the time, of a train moving or people jumping off of a train or whatever. Um, there was, I don't know that it influenced gangsters per se, but it probably must have. One of the big debates at the time was whether or not film producers and filmmakers should be allowed to depict prostitution in films and to what extent. And
Mm.
that's an odd thing to say today because courts can't intervene in what a filmmaker is allowed to put up there. But back during this time, there was a narrow interpretation of the First Amendment. Um, and of course, there are a lot of people out there saying, we don't want prostitution in the movie theaters because girls go to these movies and they say that life looks, glamorous and whatnot. For others, the bigger concern was not the effect that those films would have on people, but the movie theaters themselves. Again, the Lower East Side was the birthplace of American cinema. It had far more movie theaters per capita than anywhere in the country. And all those Eastern European immigrants who were poor, who lived in the tenements, they could go to a theater, which was sometimes air conditioned, and they could sit there all day. And some of those theaters were okay. Some of them were decent. A lot of them were dives. And of course, it got dark and no one was in there to see what you were doing. So there was a lot of prostitution in the theaters. And so again, for a lot of people, it wasn't films per se. It was just the place where films were watched. And
Mm.
so the reform movement did only target movies, but it ended up shutting down a lot of theaters as well.
Wow, that is not at all what I expected you to say. That's very interesting.
They were even against the music that was being played, right?
Probably, well, the dancing for sure. There was the turkey trot and these kinds of, women were coming into their own, especially down in the ghetto, these Eastern European, Jewish refugees, 16, 17-year olds. They were working all day in the garment factories and making money for their families while their brothers went to school and all this stuff. And they said, all right, well, this kind of sucks. On Saturday night, we want to go have a good time, we want to go to the dances. And so there was a new independence. The suffragette movement was just starting. And yeah, there was a lot of sort of lascivious dancing. And this was another thing that kind of bothered the reformers. And again, this is stuff that's on the perimeter of vice, per se. And this is part of the subject of the book. But once you get into being a reformer, once you say, I'm going to stamp out crime and vice, the question is, how far are you going to push it? What are your goals? What do you actually want to remove from society? And what is it feasible to remove? When you talk about biological impulses and certain vice that have existed since the beginning of time. So we do see in the story, we see Abe sort of struggle with almost like a revolutionary struggle. You achieve a certain amount of progress in the revolution. And then the question is, can you be happy with the progress you make, or are you going to push it too far? And we definitely see him push it.
And then it comes back to bite him in the ass because he can't get his novel published when he's older because the same vice kind of laws.
Yep. Yeah. There was a time in the 20s when there was this whole New York State Bureau of Vice Suppression run by this guy named John Sumner. And all the guy did was basically go around to bookstores and select books to ban. Ulysses by
Yes, right.
James Joyce, a lot of books famously were banned. And yeah, not to, spoiler alert, but Abe does end up self-publishing a novel at the end of all this in the 20s. And as you say, vice reform, sort of which had been the hallmark of his youth, comes back to bite him in the butt with
I
that.
really want to read this book, The Joy Peddler, because one of the things that was wild to me was that he was very influenced by James Joyce and Ulysses and wrote it. It says in the style of Ulysses, which I mean, I can't wrap my head around a crime book written like Ulysses. So is it really experimental like that?
Very experimental. Very, very experimental. He loved James Joyce. Abe was a big reader. And when Joyce came along, um, a lot people had never seen that before. It was an innovation. Um, Novels, and I don't want to throw a blanket over all of it, but having now gone through the process of writing this book and consumed a lot of popular culture from that era, I read a lot of novels that were published in the early 1900s, uh, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and those novels are like pretty boring, right? They're very slow. Just for today's reader, we have certain expectations about pacing, and there's going to be a certain amount of stuff that happens, and there's going to be some big reveals and some twists and turns. Fiction was kind of boring. Not all of it. I'm sure there were some really exciting books, and certainly there are many that are still read today. But Joyce comes along, and if you were a big reader at the time, like, wow, that's really amazing. And Abe was very much, he wanted to reflect that, and he wrote The Joy Peddler in that style. Whether it worked for him or not is sort of up for debate. There were some reviewers who liked the book but didn't think that the Joycean style served it well. So,
It can be distracting.
yeah.
Speaking of language, there's a lot of great etymology in this book. Like, for instance, I wasn't aware that racket used to mean a good time, like a dance or vacation, and then became associated with gangsters who were having a good time ripping people off. The racket
Yeah.
guys. Racket guys. That's a good name for a book right there.
Racket guys. The racket guys they were known as the racket guys in the 20s, and these were now just extortion artists, basically.
Well,
Uh,
I loved
and
how you put a glossary at the end of the book. I thought that was so
yeah,
cool. Are there any in particular euphemisms or slang that you really love?
oh gosh, there are so many. A woman with sort of a larger bottom half was referred to as a battleship. And that was not derogatory necessarily. That was a favored aspect. Racket, I think, is an amazing word because we would never think that it means anything other than what it means today. But it was used at the time really to describe a dance. There were all these dances happening on the Lower East Side, and a lot of the girls down there, if they got into trouble, they got into trouble at the rackets. Um,
Mm.
and Yeah, there were so many. I had to do the glossary because there were so many words. There were Yiddish words. There were a lot of Yiddish words that were mixed with English words. You know, a shomis. A shomis is the ninth candle on a menorah, but it also means a detective, sort of a functionary or a supporting, investigatory figure. So there are all kinds of conflations like that. A brothel was a butter factory.
Oh, that's a good one.
A kiss was a moozle. Um, uh, yeah, I don't think this is necessarily a family-friendly podcast, so we can go into anything. But a woman who specializes in oral sex was a snake charmer. So
Oh,
there were all
shit.
kinds of
Wasn't there one about the extra pocket or something about a woman who would do anal
the
sex?
the uh,
front pocket, something.
Yeah, well, a can.
A can.
Can was the word for that, and middle pocket
That's it.
was
Middle pocket.
this front and center pocket that was popular on the dresses of the time, especially for the girls who worked in factories, because the center pocket is useful for carrying
Oh,
stuff
okay.
and stuff you need to work, needles and whatnot. And so middle pocket defines sort of straight conventional sex.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's wild. So in addition to needing the glossary for the terminology in the book, we also have all these nicknames that are just great. I mean, Tony the Tough, Dopey Benny, Bald Jack Rose, Joe the Greaser, Pinchy Paul. It's funny because we just covered Pee Wee Gaskins, and he claimed that criminals with a nickname were of a higher caliber, of a higher ranking. So do you think this was true back then? Like, what's behind all these nicknames?
I don't know if it meant they were of a higher ranking or not, and why I guess if you did get a name that was some kind of badge of honor in the underworld, it was a way to identify a person without using his actual name that the police might have had on file. And the names were absolutely incredible. Jenny the Factory, Toothless Kitty Davis, Cockeye Mannheimer. These were all real people that appeared in all this incredible archival information I was able to get.
So steering it back to how you were discussing like just the history of the Jewish people, it's you really give a great history in this book, and it was so fascinating, but also disturbing. I mean, you go all the way back to the 11th century, like even the history of the word ghetto, which is actually Italian. I had no idea that was an Italian word, which means to cast or pour, as the Jewish refugees in Venice were kept on an island that had actually been a copper foundry.
Yes.
Um, and then
The
we
ghetto,
talk.
yeah, ghetto was a foundry. It was a place where copper was thrown or poured. Um, and as we were talking about that rabbi story earlier in the podcast, we were talking about a get, which is this biblically mandated document that a woman needs her husband to sign and hand over in order to release her from the marriage. So ghetto, the Italian word for a place where a copper foundry is, and a get, which describes a divorce. These Jewish people living there in what was it, 1510 or 12, they sort of use as a pun. They're like ghetto and get. It's like our divorce from society.
Oh,
So it
wow, wow.
was our get, our divorce, and then it just became ghetto. Um, and that's where that word originated from. Again, I didn't know that until I started working on this book. And it's crazy to think about, because today, if we use that word, what are its associations today? It's almost entirely black and brown, and maybe Native American. But prior to about 1945, if you said the word ghetto, its only connotation would be Jewish. And that would have been the case going back centuries. Um, so, in that sense, I feel like this book really is like the OG. It gets back to the original foundation of marginalization, leading unto anti-vice laws, leading unto vice and the underworld, which is why I felt comfortable in the subtitle called, a story of kingpins, crime busters, and the birth of the American underworld. I mean, I felt like at first I was like, oh my gosh, that's kind of bold to be saying the birth of the American underworld. But the more I worked on the book and the more I thought about it, I was very comfortable putting that out there, because I do think that this gets at the beginning of it all.
Absolutely. There was other words like I don't know, the racial slur. I'll just call it the K word, And
Yeah.
I had no idea that was a German Jewish word, and it was an insult to the Eastern Europeans. who
Yes.
were in the Pale settlement. I don't know, just really fascinating. I didn't really know any of that.
Yeah, that's the sort of intra-communal racism,
Hmm.
right? To sort of distinguish yourself from your unwashed co-religionists who you don't want to be associated with. And there was a lot of resentment between the uptowners and the downtowners. Um, this was a time before welfare. Yet another thing I didn't know before I started working on this: there was no government welfare system at all. So to the extent that the ghetto poor got welfare type things, it was given at the it was the goodwill of the wealthy, or of politicians who were trying to win over your vote. And so there was gratitude for that on the one hand, and there was a lot of resentment on the other. And there were a lot of people in the ghetto, like Abe Schoenfeld's father, who wanted all the soup kitchens and the bread lines to go away
Hmm.
because the reformers wanted uplift. They wanted to move these refugees out of the ghetto and into American life. And they saw the bread lines and the soup kitchens and the shoe giveaways as creating a certain level of reliance. And of course, again, an argument that we hear all the time today on either one side of the political aisle, or the other. But yeah, again,
Okay.
this dates back to the early 1900s.
Did you plan on having this century-long history of the Jewish people in your book when you started this project, or did it just come up as you were working on this story? It just you felt it was necessary.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I didn't know. I didn't know. I'm a research geek. I can't leave anything unread. So I have lots of different processes I go through that help me write a book. But one of those processes is just going from bibliography to bibliography until the earth has been scorched and everything has been read. And so once I find a subject I feel I need to know about, I need to read everything about it. And of course, one of the big subjects of this book, one of the big themes of this book is vice and vice control. And I wanted to know, when did vice begin? When did we first start thinking about vice, thinking about this thing that would be outlawed, thereby creating a black market? And so I just went back and back and back. And surely before the Christian money lending law, I'm sure there were anti-vice laws. But to me, like, I needed to go back at least that far. And then, you know, it was just a lot of reading, and it's sort of, I decided that I was gonna have about a millennium of Jewish history that I needed to pepper into the narrative, because I you don't want to be going on these big historical digressions. You need to be keeping the narrative moving. But I wanted to pepper in this backstory. And so the question became, like, of all this sweeping history, this 1,000 years of history, what are you going to include in the book? What is going to be your guiding light through it? And so what I decided was the goal was I was going to tell the history through the lens of vice. And so I'm trying to take readers through that 1,000 years of marginalization, vice. We go from money lending to liquor to drugs to prostitution
Gambling.
and gambling. Yeah.
So I consider myself a true crime guy, but I want to admit there was something in here that I had never heard of. We kind of glanced over it real quick. And the horse poisoning. What? That's some crazy racket.
Crazy, crazy racket. And those guys were kind of the first racketeers in the days before, when a racket still referred to a dance or a party or a good time. Um, they were running a real racket. It was a straight extortion game. These guys had done this back in the Pale of Settlement, the ghetto in Russia where they were fleeing from. And when they came to New York, it's hard to drop those old habits. And there was there was a horse poisoning gang that was prominent, and they would go to businesses on the Lower East Side, ideally businesses that relied on horses to transport their goods. And the best ones to extort were people that sold, perishable items, where they not only needed a horse to transport it, but they needed a horse to move quickly to get their ice cream to the retailer before it melted, or to get the box of strawberries to someone before it went bad in the summer. So you go to someone like that, you say, hey, we're going to need $500 a month, or, you're going to lose a couple horses in your stable or whatever. And people would say no, and then they would come to work the next day and they'd be down a couple of horses. It was a brutal game. And that was, again, like one of those things that you just cannot make up. There was a leader of the gang. He was known as the King of the Horse Poisoners. And
I want a name.
yeah, what they did is they took flaxseed, and which is a bit sweet, and they would fry it into balls with arsenic. And they'd go feed these little arsenic fry balls to the horses, and it would take about 12 to 24 hours to do its work. So the next day, you'd be out in your delivery route, dropping off your ice cream or whatever, and all of a sudden, the horse would just drop in the middle of
The one guy was, I think, was it the Brooklyn Bridge? Some bridge, right? He blocked all the traffic, and then the cops come up to him and start harassing him.
Yeah. Yeah, this was an ice cream dealer who had tried to defy the horse poisoners, and he learned his lesson. But the horse poisoner gang is one of many organizations that our reformers and the crusaders need to go after. And it's a kind of terrifying confrontation, because these were mean people. These were people who were willing to go to the absolute limit. And the whole horse scene at the time is interesting to think about, because right when this story is taking place, 1911, 12, 13, 14, those are the years when the city is in the process of switching from being almost entirely horses to being almost entirely cars.
And trains.
And I think 1912, 13, those were the years when it was about 50-50.
Mm.
So these poor horses, I mean, they're out on these Manhattan streets, Brooklyn streets, and they got all these automobiles flying by them. So the horses were constantly getting spooked. A horse might get spooked and all of a sudden take off down Fifth Avenue, run up onto the sidewalk, start galloping down the sidewalk. There's a baby left in a carriage outside of a store while mom went in to check a couple things out. And all of a sudden the horse is bolting. Things like that happened every day. And I have a whole folder. I have a whole folder of like newspaper art. In fact, right here here's my horse poisoner folder. This is a 3-ring binder.
Wow.
This is a 3-ring binder that's pretty much full of, one of the sections is just newspaper articles about all this horse trauma.
Who's that on the back there?
This is the king of the horse poisoners.
That's him, huh? Look at that mug.
Yashki the horse poisoner, Joseph Tablinski. Yeah.
Wow. Another thing I didn't realize was that during Prohibition, over half of the bootleggers were Eastern European Jews. Why do you think we don't see that in modern culture? Always we see like Al Capone, or we see like rednecks down in Kentucky with stills or something. You never really, you never see Eastern European Jewish folks depicted as being part of the bootlegging.
I don't know why that is. A lot of those figures were a lot of those underworld figures, like Charles King Solomon in Boston. Every city had one. They were well known at the time, and today are totally lost to history.
We need a gangster movie about that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We definitely do. It's a very interesting part of Prohibition, the Jazz Age, that, as you say, is totally been lost. Yeah.
A few months ago, we had author Michael Woolrake on the show, and he was talking about his book, The Bishop and the Butterfly. It picks up right where yours ends. It tells about the downfall of
Yeah.
Tammany Hall. You happen to read that or check that out? You know him at all?
I have seen the book and I'm excited to read it, but I have not gotten it yet. As I remember it, there's a murder
Hmm.
involved and a Tammany Hall. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think that Tammany Hall, which plays an important role in the Incorruptibles, they were kind of, in a way, and I doubt Democrats today would like want to talk about this at length, but Tammany Hall was kind of the beginning of the Democratic Party
Right.
in the country in a way. New York being the most populous Democratic state in the early 1900s, and Tammany Hall being the Democratic Party, and at the time there was a lot of corruption because their constituency tended to be poor, tended to be immigrants, and one of the ways you could consolidate loyalty amongst those folks was through impunity for crime. So impunity for crime was a big part of what was going on in the Lower East Side, and that was one of the things that made reform so hard. Was you had a lot going against you because you couldn't just take on the vice peddlers; you had to take on the Tammany Hall sponsors as well.
So I kind of wanted to switch gears a little bit away from the more scholarly and academic side of what you do, because Matt and I were really pretty chuffed to see that you have two projects being turned into television shows. So would you like to tell our listeners about some of your other work and what's going on with that?
Yeah, so several projects in development that have been in development for a while. No books of mine have been turned into television shows or movies yet, but they're in various stages of the process. A book I published in 2016 called Wolf Boys, which is about American teenage boys living on the border with Mexico who become assassins for the Zetas, the big Mexican drug cartel. That book is set up at 101 Studios with Antoine Fuqua directing. For listeners who watch Yellowstone and the associated Yellowstone shows, the prequels, those are all made by 101. And of course, Antoine Fuqua made his name with Training Day and Denzel Washington, and does the Equalizer movies and stuff. So that's where that is at the moment. Um, the other project is the Rabbi Story. The Rabbi Gangster story is set up at Paramount. Again, there's writers assigned and scripts being written and so forth. Um, and then we'll see what happens with this next book. There was an ebook I did called The Officer and the Entrepreneur that came out in 2000, I believe 2018, 2017. That was one of my favorite projects. A story about these soldiers, black soldiers who come back from the Middle East, and when they get to their base back in Colorado, there's a lot of PTSD. There's lots of problems. Their lives kind of slowly fall apart for different reasons. And as things are going to pot for them personally, they get approached by these DEA agents who are posing as members of a drug cartel. And over the course of the story, you see how these soldiers are kind of lured into agreeing to participate in this sweeping, criminal conspiracy that doesn't actually exist. Um, and that story was in development for a while and is no longer, but hopefully it'll get picked up by somebody new. Um, yeah.
And then what
So
about any new writing projects? So sorry, Matt. I'm so curious as to what else you're working on.
Yeah, so at the moment, I am working on a book about myself, which I never was not necessarily on the bucket list until recently. But that is a memoir about childhood trauma and recovery. It's a mental health memoir, a memoir of healing and the journey that I've gone on to become a more functional person. And so that's been my passion. Recently, I was working on a documentary project that recently premiered on Netflix, that is about the rise and fall of the Third Reich. That's a 6-part documentary series that came out a couple of weeks ago.
I watched it. You
Yeah.
worked on that?
Yeah, I was working on it early. The people who made it, when they first optioned William Shire's 1963 book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, nobody wanted to read a 1,300-page book. They needed someone to read the 1,300-page book and sort of outline it and break it down into a potential like 6-episode outline. So I was working with them at the very beginning, and then the project sold to Netflix, and Netflix produced it with somebody in-house who actually he does a lot of the true crime stuff for Netflix. And Netflix was looking at this Nazi story as a true crime story, as a kind of a gangster story, which in a way is what it was. So that was fun to work on. It's been fun to watch that, find a very sizable audience that I never would have imagined. That was a good example of working on something and thinking, gosh, where is this gonna end up? Are people gonna sign up for a 6-hour docudrama deep dive into the rise and fall of the Nazis?
It was fucking awesome.
Yeah, thanks. No, it turned out well. They did a good job. They colorized all the archival footage, which was really cool. The people who made it had been inspired by Peter Jackson's World War I documentary that came out on HBO a few years earlier. Of course, he put all of his own money into that, and he did a colorization and spent like a boatload of money colorizing the film. And so the producers of this Nazi series, they were like, hey, I wonder if we can colorize our archival footage, but cut the price down a lot. And so they were able to pull off that sort of technical feat. And I feel like it adds a lot because there are points in that series where you can't even, sometimes it'll shift between the dramatization and the archive and you can't even tell. So yeah, they did a nice job. And I thought it was cool too, just talking about kind of narrative structure, how they toggle back and forth between the Nuremberg trials and the story of the rise and fall. You've seen the Social Network, the Facebook story, the Mark Zuckerberg story, the movie that I think came out in 2009. There was a similar structure there. If you've seen that story, where there's flash ahead to the depositions over the trial. Zuckerberg is getting sued for stealing Facebook. And then,
it's so weird to think of those two together.
I know, isn't it? But that's what we storytellers do. We see something that's cool, like a structure like that, and we think of, oh man, how could you use that? Ideally, in a totally different setting where no one's going to think of the thing you stole. So.
I feel like we touched on all the big points, so I don't know if you want to get a little more nitty gritty, or if you want to, Dan, is there anything else that you want to tell listeners about that we didn't pick up on in our reading of the book?
I feel like we've covered. I was not expecting to cover so much ground. You guys are so well prepared. It seems like you read the book.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's kind of our thing. And Matt is I mean, more props to Matt. He's always he's the research guy that goes farther than the book. So he, anything that you touched on that we wanted to explore more deeply, he kind of took with and ran, and we just were really excited to chat with you. And we definitely are going to be encouraging all of our listeners to pick up a copy of the book, because it's just such a it has so much going for it. It's not just like true crime like we talked about. It's history and, you know, the glossary and the, you know, the
culture,
the women's stories, and the, you know, it's a really well-rounded approach to the topic that I think in a lesser writer's hands would have potentially would definitely not have been this robust and satisfying, but could have just fallen completely flat. So kudos to you.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I think we've covered so much. Like, I apologize if some of my answers were a bit rambling, but hopefully you can edit things down, and I look forward to hearing the podcast. I have a new podcast to listen to now, so that's exciting.
Nice. Well, if I don't need an operation, I'll go home. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Slater. The book is called The Incorruptibles. It will be released on July 16th. We will put links in the show notes. Thanks again so much for coming on. It was a great conversation, so enlightening, and great book.
Thank you, Matthew and Christa. I love being on.
Thank you, Dan, and best of luck with the release and all of the author events and everything you've got going on.
Alrighty, guys.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend.
Have a great you
July.
too. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.